Manor Lords is a pretty impressive early access offering by Greg Stickson, who's been labelled as a solo developer receiving help from contractors. Published by Hooded Horse, Manor Lords is a single-player title offering 80% medieval city builder
by exploiting the workers
and 20% RTS combat. So it ends up being the love child of medieval Total War and Banished. The main goal in Manor Lords is to build and develop a prosperous village, while ousting local bandits and rival lords that have claimed lands that rightfully belong to you. While there certainly are wars to fight, the majority of your time will be spent fighting standard survival mechanics and preventing your people from going hungry, dying of the cold, and various diseases. It straddles a neat line of enjoying the downtime to increase village efficiency and aesthetics, but also offering short-term thrills of defending against raids, or even opposing lords. There's currently 3 different gameplay modes to dive into. The first one, the one on the left, offers the traditional sandbox experience. You don't have to contend with bandits, and it essentially plays just like a casual medieval city builder. The middle one is what I would describe as the standard offering. You need to contend with a rival lord, as well as bandits to push back both, gain renown, and eventually take all the lands in the 9-tile map, and claim victory. I haven't tried the last offering, but what I understand, it's a harder version of the same situation, with bandit frequency turned up. As the game is in early access, there aren't really any cutscenes to speak of, and the narrative is fairly absent from gameplay. You're given the goals, and how you set about getting there is really up to you. It took me a few goes to really come to grips with the gameplay of Manor Lords. There are tutorial boxes that show up, as well as the help function that can be accessed by right-clicking on parts of the UI. But if you choose to barge in like I did, it can quickly become pretty humbling. In retrospect, I would probably recommend starting with the sandbox game mode first, just to play around a little and learn the early priorities that really seem to matter and can actually change a failing run into a successful run. I did find this pretty helpful without the distraction of bandits running to and fro and stealing all of my berries and tools.
I fucking hate
bandits.
This will get messy.
When you start a Manor Lord scenario, you'll be randomly chucked into one of the 9 tiles, and each of these have food sources and economy sources. You can hunt the local deer populace for meat and hides, you can go berry picking, you can set up farms on fertile lands, mine for iron, clay and stone, and you can set up trade routes to import or export for financial or resource gain. Each of these resources is different in the 9 tiles, and the representation of these resources as icons can tell you which are stronger resources in your particular area, denoted by a crown that sits above the resource. After you've checked your map, you'll quickly see that your starting resources are pretty thin. There's a tent, a bunch of wood, a guy with a very unfortunate name, and some bread that's been thrown into a muddy puddle at the side of the road. There's no backstory of how we got here, but I'm going to assume it involved a nasty divorce and or some kind of unspeakable rendezvous with the only ox that we've brought with us. Anyway, we need to face the immediate problem. Limited food supply, 5 families we need to feed, and winter coming. Manor Lords certainly doesn't waste any time before screwing you over. It will remind you that you'll need to erect houses for your 5 starting families before winter or they'll freeze to death. And it'll pretty soon start pounding your peasants with rain to make sure their bread is soggy and ruined. I speak from experience. So I'm going to transition a little bit here from review into some early game tips. So I present to you now phrase 4 F's for f***ing success. Food, firewood, fashion, and faith. Firstly, food. You'll need to build a granary and a storage building to store that bread and wood before the elements ruin it all. If you assign one of your villagers to the granary to get the bread in ASAP, this will really help a lot. You'll also need to quickly establish a consistent source of replenishable food. I'd advise a mix of hunting the local deer and having a berry picking family while you're concentrating on the next thing, firewood. Get a woodsman going straight away so that you'll have consistent firewood coming in to build a reserve of wood to stave off the coming winter cold. Fashion and faith will come a little bit later, once you've got more settlers, so focus on getting the food, the firewood and some houses up first. My starting 5 families are often split into 1 hunter, 1 berry picker, 1 woodsman, 1 storage guy that I quickly repurpose as a logger once all the food is out of the weather, and 1 family free to allow for construction of houses. Provided you have enough houses and your approval is above 50%, you'll attract more citizens that can then be put to the task of tannery to turn hides into clothing, that's the fashion part, and pretty soon you'll be able to build a church. Once you have these 4 things, food, firewood, fashion and faith, you'll be able to upgrade the houses to level 2, meaning potential space for more families, the ability to have them grow vegetables or chickens and eggs in their yard for extra food, and some income for the town as well. Also, it helps a great deal to get a second ox as soon as you have the funds to do it. So that's it, those are my tips for early game. With all of that, it's relatively easy to survive that first winter and start to look at expanding your town into farming if the lands are fertile enough, or trading and industry in that second year, all depending on the strengths of your tile area. It's quite an addictive gameplay loop, and after that initial food crisis has abated, it becomes a relaxing efficiency game. You can dial up the speed from 1x to make things happen a little faster, and I will admit that most of my playtime was set at the highest speed because I was just too impatient to wait. I made houses with large yards for vegetables and apple orchards, and I started a lucrative trade business in ceramic tiles. One of the things I neglected for far too long was the technology tree at the very top of the screen. Over time, your village levels up when it reaches certain thresholds. For example, I think the first level dings when you have about 5 level 2 houses. These level ups give a development point, which can then be thrown into any of the 4 tech trees, which improve things like decreasing trade costs, farming with a heavy plow, increasing blacksmithing proficiency, etc. It makes dramatic game changes and it can really help you out. When the raiders or brigands come calling, you'll need to either have a militia set up, enough cash to hire mercenaries, or have a castle retinue, which you can customize to your liking. This is where we can get into the combat side of things. Bandits will frequently steal your food, your tools, and even your weapons sometimes. It can be frustrating to lose those resources, but it's actually good to gather your minimal forces and bust some heads as soon as you can. If you don't want to dirty your hands with this, more often than not, your AI rival lord will send some men to deal with the bandits in the area. But because there are significant rewards for doing so, it's often better if you beat them to the punch. Even with 10 spearmen against 16 raiders, I haven't had too much trouble winning battles. Provided I walked the men and didn't fatigue them, and I held them in position as the enemy charged at me, we came out with barely 1 or 2 casualties. If you then march the company to the bandit encampment, you'll usually score a couple hundred gold and some renown that you'll actually be able to later use in purchasing more land tiles. That was a lot of chat about gameplay, so let's change tack and touch on graphics and sound. First up, graphically. I mean, if it isn't apparent already from the footage, let me tell you, this game is gorgeous. I think the one word that summarizes the graphics and more generally the game as a whole is authentic. The single map that's currently available in the early access looks incredible from every angle. It's amazingly realistic. Weather and seasons roll by with snow, fog, rain, and even the red of the autumn trees is here. If you look carefully, you can actually see the clouds in the distance approaching your town, and then soon after, see the rain falling on your villages. It's just insane. Berries only grow in springtime and die off in the winter, so it forces you to make sure you collect them early in the season before they vanish for the year. Likewise, the farms are ploughed and sowed and harvested through the yearly seasons, so it all gives the world an incredibly realistic, lived-in feel. First-person view is also a fun addition that I really appreciate. You can click on the eyeball at the top right of the screen and inhabit a little lordly avatar so you can wander through your village. It's got some jank to it currently, invisible walls appear here and there, but it's clearly stated that this feature is still being worked on. Moving on to sound and music, usually one of my favourites. There's some Gregorian chanting going on in the background, which was pretty nice, but nothing that was really affecting during gameplay. There is also a shift in music during battles and raids, which was a welcome change, but again, it was more serviceable than being anything memorable. The village sounds and idle gossip initially are pretty good, but there is a lot of repeated phrases. I heard the one about the baby spitting on his dad so many times over my playthroughs, I kind of got a bit sick of it. So at this point in these early access title reviews, I do like to think about what I would want improved, kind of some feedback to the developers, I guess. There's not a whole bunch to complain about here. I think there are a few things I would like to see change in the UI to make it easier to play and enjoy. Firstly, I think it would be nice to have some kind of profession spreadsheet, similar to Banished, or a system like we get in Planet Zoo, where you can see your populace and their current profession, and you can plus someone else in or minus someone out and like move them around. Some kind of overview panel would be quite welcome. I think the tutorial in the middle difficulty gameplay mode is a little lacking and probably could use a little bit of attention, but this may come closer to full release. The other things are more minor niggles really. Some message or acknowledgement that you have development points that haven't been used that pops up every now and then would be a welcome change. And also some reminder that you have houses that are ready for upgrade as well would be really great. Manor Lords is only in early access, but it's already worthy of its retail price in my humble opinion. If you enjoyed Banished or any of the strategy games like Total War, Civilization, Age of Empires, Tropico, even City Skylines, I think you'll find an awful lot to like in Manor Lords. At times, it could be considered a little slow, and I've seen some criticism of the pacing, but I actually enjoyed the game speeds available and wouldn't change a thing. Despite an initial learning curve coming to grips with the game systems, I think there's a lot of accessibility that has been carefully constructed behind the scenes, and this will no doubt be easier for those players familiar with previous city builders. If you lack a bit of patience, I can see some mechanisms causing frustration, so before you commit to purchasing, try and evaluate whether you're the kind of player that wants quick wins, because if so, this may not be the title for you. For everyone else, I think you'll be in for a real treat. Now, someone make a dragon mod so I can watch Alduin the World Eater burn my peasants to ash.